Welcome to the very first episode of STIGMA, a show to talk about things that we don't like to talk about, a show to share stories that we don't like to hear, but more importantly, a show to empower the voices of survivors who for so long have been silenced. This is STIGMA, and we're launching this series in June for Pride Month. And this whole month and these next few episodes will be dedicated to our LGBTQ champions, their stories, their struggles, and their inspirations. And in our first ever episode, I've got the wonderful and incredible Brandon Ingram. Welcome, Brandon.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for agreeing to do this show with me and being my very first guest.
I love it. I love it. I love anything that has to do with anything about, things that we don't talk about. Love that.
And that's what this show is all about. So tell me, Brandon, tell us about who you are. Who is Brandon Ingram?
I'm still kind of figuring that out for myself. And I think a huge part of the process of growing up and getting to know yourself, it's an exercise that never really stops. So I have been an author. I continue to be a writer, an actor, a dancer, a singer, all kinds of things. I've been in advertising, but that's just me naming all of the other things that you can probably associate me with. As to the question of who I am, I think at heart it's an ever-growing, ever full of new knowings kind of process. I'll let you know when I know.
No, it's good. I don't think we should box ourselves into anything, right? We are such diverse people. There are so many facets to describe ourselves.
Absolutely.
So why just use one term when there can be 100 ways to describe ourselves? But this particular episode, this month that we're launching this episode is Pride Month. And we want to highlight the stories of the members of the LGBTIQ community. Would you say that you are a member of this community?
Absolutely. I think that coming into it has taken some time, and I think the process of doing that has taken many years.
Would you call yourself a gay man?
In this present moment in time, possibly. Okay. And I say that because I've ventured through different ends of the sexual orientation spectrum. I started off like anyone, believing in the heteronormative identities that were given, assigned, that I was straight. I moved from there into a sense of exploring bisexuality for a while. I think I've been in more relationships with women than I have with men at this point in my life, which is very interesting. I settled in very comfortably into my sexuality. I think in my late 20s and my early 30s. I think it's one of those things where if we believe in the idea that human beings as beings, as a species, that we continuously keep growing, and that universal consciousness is something that continuously keeps expanding. The same has to be true for how we view our sexuality, or how we view relationships, or how we view anything in life. So I think it's an ever-expanding process.
You said you've been on this journey of discovering your sexual orientation. When would you say your journey started? When would you say that you were sort of pushed to be heterosexual or accept a heteronormative narrative?
I don't know that there was ever a pushing into it so much as there was you're just born into this world, and that's the norm that I think you yourself expect that you will take on and that you will become. And because you're moving through all of these systems, structures, whether it's at home, whether it's at school, whether it's in a social event, you're seeing structures that are based on the heteronormative narrative. So obviously, in the search for identity, you're looking to find your place inside that. Because we come from a background, a culture, a society where that sort of thing is just put down into being like a phase. Oh, it's just a phase. He'll get over it, she'll get over it, they'll get over it, whatever.
You mentioned school. Did you realize you were different when you were in school?
Of course, absolutely. And
how old would you say you first realized that you were different to the other boys?
I think when I was about 7 years old. When I was 7, was during it was during that time when I realized that, hey, I like things that are slightly different. If all the boys had like a certain sport that they were into or a certain activity that they were getting into, I'd like to be a part of that. And I have I've played basketball and table tennis and all of these things, but I never really enjoyed it until like the arts came into my life. And even to say that is categorically saying that if you are a certain way, then arts is for you. Or there are loads of gay men out there who are extremely talented sportsmen. That started at 7, and I maneuvered through, your parents tend to give you all of these labels. I think it's something that we used in Funny Boy as well, like he's just creative. Creative is something that you use to describe anyone who's different, right? And that process sort of like, it went on. I explored, everything that teenagers explore. I had girlfriends, went through all of the different... Did you go to
a mixed school? Or
no, I was at Wesley, so I went to a boys only school. But we had lots of interactions that would happen at drama competitions and whenever we would meet like at matches and stuff like that.
And did the boys notice that you were a bit different to what a boy should be like?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I wasn't the only one. There were others in school, and it was, you're looking back on it now, I think when you're in it, it's a lot more difficult to maneuver and a lot more difficult to see, because at that point in life, that's your only point in life. You're not looking at life from like a 30, 40, 50 year perspective. You are just a teenager whose problems are bigger than anyone else's in the world. And from that point of view, it seems like a bit harsh and cruel and all of the stuff that goes on.
Did they use any insults against you?
Lots of them,
like
lots
what?
of them.
You can say whatever you want to say here.
The usual stuff, I guess, that you want to say when you're describing someone that is different to you in that way. So, Gani, Vesi, Ponnaya, there's just like a long list of that stuff that you just get like so emotionally lambasted with.
So but the other boys would use those insults against you?
Definitely, yeah, absolutely. But I've also had, I have to say, boys who've reached out to me in the recent past who've apologized for their behavior back in the day. Friends who have reached out 25 years later saying, I behaved in this way, I spoke to you in this way, I called you this thing. And that was just me trying to navigate through my own stuff. And it had nothing to do with you, and I think I was an unfair friend, and I think it was a terrible thing. So I think that that's the thing that matters, that I wasn't going through it alone. Because from what I know of how people deal with their emotions and how they lash out right now in life, I know that the kids who lashed out and did what they did were obviously going through something much more even possibly than I was. Because
But then when you were, of course, you were a child, right? And you were being subjected to bullying and abuse. It's not your duty to think about, your abuser or your bullies could be going through worse, right?
And back then, of course, I didn't think that way. Now I think that way. Now I want to have like an open perspective.
Do you think your school could have done more, or schools in general could have done more?
They could have, and they should have. I know there was lots of conversations that were had with teachers, lots of conversations that were had with like that entire body of people who were meant to be like our guardians, and how I remember one particular sectional head, we used to call them, like the masters who were in charge of like a certain section. He once told me, he said this to me in Sinhalese, he said, "Dang mehemai Brandon, oya diha baluhama dang oya hari lassanai ne, right? Lassana lamainta ohoma wenawa, right? And eka api baragata yutu deyak. That this is how this system functions. If you were beautiful," and what he was trying to say is if your physical appearance was outside that of something that was how a boy was supposed to look, or if your features were like, slightly effeminate or whatever, which I all translated in my mind many years later, was that's just the norm, and you're going to be treated a little bit different. He even tried to take it, like, to make me feel better, take it into places like that other people were jealous and like whatever. And I look back on those conversations now and I'm like, wow, that's really toxic, because not only are you making me sort of trying to make me feel okay with a system that you as a person of authority cannot change or handle in the way that you're supposed to, but you're also trying to create this level of competition and animosity between me and my peers.
And also justifying the abuse you were going through because of the way you
because
looked.
of your appearance or because of your behavior, or whatever it is. And when I say behavior, I don't mean like any kind of negative behavior, like just the way you are, just like who you are.
How differently do you think that sectional head could have dealt with this? What advice would you give to other sectional heads?
I would say that if you are someone in education right now, and if a young child is going through sort of stuff that I went through, anyone like me went through at the time, and if you're having a conversation with them, stop trying to ingrain them into a system that has already been perpetuated for like so many years, and try to understand the nuanced nature of what has to be done. Why is this child going through this right now, and how do you sort of create an environment that allows them to be comfortable in themselves? Because I think a lot of people in this country leave school believing that they've got like a lot of things, a lot of their basic stuff like in order, but nobody teaches us how to be empathetic. Nobody teaches us how to care for someone else's feelings or understand someone else's feelings. And so we have like a bunch of adults who are moving through a society, a community, further building this hatred and this lack of empathy. And that's what starts the violence, and that's what starts all of the negative stuff that happens, because education plays such a pivotal role in that, and the people who are the persons of authority in those establishments play such an important role in that.
So they're not preparing their students to the real world.
I don't think anyone is. If you look at our country right now, I think the reason that we are where we are is because no one prepared us for that stuff, No one has prepared us for anything other than becoming a doctor, lawyer, engineer. Those are like the three big things, right?
Getting married, having children.
Exactly. Yeah.
No matter how miserable you are.
Yeah.
But when you were going through this difficult period in school, I mean, you must have had a support system.
No.
You didn't have friends or family who supported you?
I did have friends, and my family, I think, is fantastically supportive, but this was not the kind of conversation that I was made to believe I could have with anybody. You can't, it's outside of your scope of thinking when you're that age to even tell yourself that you could go home and speak to your family and say, I am being called this in school, I am being treated this way in school. So no, there was like zero people to, and the thing is, you get pushed to like a certain level, and then the conversations around you start being about maybe he should see a psychiatrist, maybe, and then there's all of the stigma that's around that, because talking to someone about your mental health suddenly means pisu. You are out of your mind, you're crazy, you're insane, all of this negative stuff that we have, that we build up against, like, projecting our mental health. We don't have a problem with going to a doctor when something is wrong with our physical health, but to see someone when we think our mental health is deteriorating suddenly makes you insane. I have someone that I speak to, a professional that I speak to in life now, not all the time, but whenever I feel like my mental health is taking a toll against my work or a relationship or the way I view something happening or something that I think I have done wrong, there is a professional that I speak to, and I recommend that everyone have that person. We have to normalize having a therapist, But
you didn't have that person as a child when you needed that support. Your school didn't have a counselor?
Not at all.
You said you came out in your late 20s. Do you think your experience in school as a child, the lack of support you felt you had or you didn't receive, you think that made you take that much longer to come out? Do you think you could have come out earlier?
Absolutely, and I think a lot of kids today are lucky that we are connected to the world in the way that we are, and it happened like gradually. I think in my early 20s there were people in my life that I could talk about it to. I was still navigating through it myself, and then it was like in my late 20s, early 30s that I had the conversations with the important people, my mother, my family.
Let's talk about your mother. I mean, she's a very famous person, Corinne
Famous person.
Corinne Almeida, everyone.
Just Almeida, no
okay,
deal.
okay. Everyone knows her, everyone grew up listening to her. She was a role model for many.
She still is.
Was she a role model to you?
Of course. My mom is the reason that I think I have the courage to continue speaking in the way that I do, and living my life the way that I do. Because one thing I always remember her saying, like from my small days, and she may have heard it from someone else, but she would always say, "Attaki bimeda gannai baya wenna epa," right? And it's something that I will take to my grave. And I think that was what was most difficult about the time before coming out, is that I was not being true to myself. And that is really the only hurdle that you have to cross over. It's not about your family or your friends or the people in society or whatever. If you are confident in who you are, everyone else just falls into place. Everything else falls into place. But this relationship that you have with yourself, the need to get over that curb of sort of saying, I actually love myself this way and it's okay, takes a lot of time.
So when you told your mother as her child, what was her response?
I mean, it was a very emotional day for us, because that was like one of many topics that we discussed at the same time. So there was like a lot of misunderstanding and miscommunication in like what reaction she was having to which part of what we were talking about. But I remember we had this really beautiful moment where she walked into my room and I was just crying and crying and crying. And she said, "What is this? What's going on? Why are you crying now?" And I said, "Well, because you said this and that." And she said, "No, none of that makes any difference to me. I do have issues with like this and the other, but when it comes to who you are, that is not an issue for me. And I love you, all of you, and this is not something that is even a factor."
Was it a shock to her? Did she?
I don't think it was a shock as such. It was just that if you look at who we are culturally, we don't have these conversations with our parents, right? So when you are stripped of all of those other pretexts and all of those other things that you don't get into with your parents, which I think everyone should, that is the shock. That you've somehow sort of like crossed this boundary into talking about stuff that for generations we've been told, we're not going to talk about that with the kids. Let them do what they want, and we'll just look the other way, or we'll pretend like we don't know. That
pretend
was the shock.
Like we were never children ourselves.
Ourselves, yeah. So I think that was the shock, that, oh my God, this conversation is now happening. It's like live. But I think after that, it's been great.
How was it actually when you came out to your family and friends? What did you feel?
I think just like a great release, just like a weight being lifted off.
And did it impact your career and your profession?
Absolutely. I think becoming comfortable in myself has just allowed me to not hide behind, because previously I'd have all of these things to think about, like when I was in a room, if this person perceives me like this, then maybe we wouldn't get this business. If this person sees me like this, then maybe I will lose them as a friend. If they think that I am this way, then there's a possibility that this won't happen. It's like you're maneuvering a lot inside you before the first word even comes out of your mouth. But when this has been taken away from you, you can just be you. And yeah, I just feel great in my skin.
That's amazing. That's just so inspiring to many of us. And in that note, Brandon, I mean, looking back at what you've achieved today and what you've become as a person today, what would you tell your 13-year-old, 15-year-old self? If you had that chance to go back to that little boy, Brandon, in school, being bullied, lonely, crying, what would you tell him?
Trust.
Trust who?
Just trust the process, because I think I came to faith very late in life. I mean, I've come from a religious background. Finding my way from religion into spirituality took some time, and I am a spiritual person today, not a religious person. And I think because of everything that had been built up around me, I was very sure that life was meant to be miserable for me. And I did not trust at all that anyone had my best interests at heart, that anyone was going to be there for me, that anyone would love me if they knew who I was in my entirety, my whole self. I didn't trust any of it, and it all boils down to I didn't trust myself. I didn't trust myself to figure things out, to find my way, to get to where I needed to go. And trust is the thing that I wouldn't say late, I think we all come into it in our own journey, in our own time, so I came to it in my own time too. But if we're playing this game of like go back in time and do this thing, I would say just trust yourself and the process.
And what would you say to another gay or bisexual man or woman or anyone from the LGBTIQ community who's still in the closet, who still hasn't come to terms with themselves, who still has fear? What would you tell them?
I would say take your time, because I don't think there's any sort of rush to sort of become something. I think one of the best experiences that this life has given me is not being tethered to any kind of social pressure. Like you said before, there's no pressure on me to get married before a certain age, have X many children. If I want to do those things, there is still time to do those things. But I think in the fast-paced world that we sort of live in, we want solutions to happen now. Again, I moved to the situation in the country. You can't expect 30, 40 years of a crisis to be solved like that in a day. Things are going to take time. And that's the same thing we do to ourselves. So someone who's going through this sort of, tends to feel like, because of all of the information and the messaging that we keep getting over and over again, that they have to figure everything today, right now. And that sort of adds more pressure, then it adds more fear, and then you're suddenly like, no, if I get married and settle down, then all of these feelings will go away, and then of course they don't. My advice to people would be take time to know yourself. Take time to know yourself, as well as all of the TV shows that you watch, as well as all of the sleeping patterns of the person that you're stalking on Facebook, as well as all of the smells of the cooking that comes out of your mother's kitchen. Take that same time to know and understand yourself, and be okay with who you are. Then, if you want to let the rest of the world know, that's okay too.
Great. Thank you so much, Brandon.
Thank you.
Thank you for this conversation and agreeing to come here and be the first person for me to interview, and for sharing your story. It's powerful, it's appropriate, and it's inspiring. So thank you.
Thank you, and happy Pride.
Happy Pride.